that promoted good leering. Multiple, quote, providers registered to the same address and no kids present. It's amazing having child care centers and autism centers with no kids. And by the way, it's not subtle. You walk up, there's no toys, there's no kids, and the windows are blacked out. This is not hidden. It is obvious, except for the Democrats that didn't want to see it. Had the state done its job, had it sent inspectors instead of press releases, that fraud would have been obvious. To understand just how calculated this fraud became, consider the most disturbing example of all. In September 2025, federal prosecutors charged Asha Farhan Hassan for orchestrating a $14 million fraud scheme against Minnesota's EIDBI autism program. The program exists to provide medically necessary early and intensive care to children with autism. Fraudsters turned it into a profit engine. According to the charges, Hassan and her partners recruited children from the Somali community, paid parents cash kickbacks, used unqualified individuals as quote-unquote therapists, and billed Medicaid for services never provided or grossly inflated. Where a child did not already have an autism diagnosis, the scheme allegedly worked to obtain one. In other words, there was no child they could not qualify because the diagnosis itself became the means to an end. According to the University of Minnesota, 1 in 12 8-year-old Somali children in Minnesota was diagnosed with autism, compared with 1 in 28 non-Somali children statewide. In Minnesota, Somali children are 7 times more likely than their non-Somali peers to receive autism quote-unquote treatment. These figures show extraordinary concentration and extraordinary billing, the precise conditions fraudsters exploit. And here's the deepest human cost. Telling an immigrant child that he has autism, not because he does, but because someone wants to get paid. Imagine the weight of that diagnosis on parents who may not speak English fluently, who trust authority, who believe the government would never lie about their child's health. That label could follow a child for life, shaping education, self-image, and opportunity. Doing that for financial enrichment is not merely fraud, it is the deliberate exploitation of children and the calculated betrayal of parents. And once fraud proceeds are laundered and sent overseas, in 2023, the Somali diaspora sent nearly $2 billion back to Somalia. Once they're sent overseas, they're effectively unrecoverable. Meanwhile, Al-Shabaab, the U.S.-designated foreign terrorist organization and al-Qaeda's affiliate in Somalia, controls large swaths of territory and systematically extorts money moving through its financial channels. When billions of dollars are stolen from U.S. welfare programs and sent abroad, there is no credible way to ensure those funds do not enrich jihadists within Al-Shabaab. As one confidential source told the Manhattan Institute, the largest funder of Al-Shabaab, an Islamist terrorist organization in Somalia, is the Minnesota taxpayer. Listen to that again. The single largest funder of Al-Shabaab, a terrorist organization in Somalia, is the taxpayers of Minnesota. Taken together, the evidence before this committee leads to one unavoidable conclusion. Minnesota was warned. Minnesota's Democrat leadership failed to enforce the laws it passed, and that failure allowed organized fraud to flourish, harming children, betraying families, and robbing the public of trust and resources. This hearing is necessary because Minnesota's elected Democrats were complicit in this fraud. They stood to benefit politically from looking the other way as fraudsters robbed the taxpayers of Minnesota. Look at the bench of witnesses. To this hearing, I invited Governor Tim Walz. He's not here. I invited Attorney General Ellison. He's not here. I invited Mayor Fry and Tiki Brown, the commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Children, Youth, and Families. Not one of them agreed to testify and defend his or her conduct. They are hiding out after having served as the lookout in a bank robbery that was robbing the taxpayers of Minnesota. The people of Minnesota and the American people deserve better. And not a one of these Democrats has given any credible excuse why they're terrified to answer questions. I now recognize the ranking member.
What a strange thing it is to have a hearing about Minnesota that doesn't address what's on the front pages of every newspaper about Minnesota: the violent and unwelcome federal occupation of its largest city by the chairman's political party, an occupation that has already caused the deaths at federal agents' hands of 2 American citizens and left many more injured, and that is roundly criticized by law enforcement leaders, including those in Texas, as unprofessional and dangerous. That may explain why elected officials in Minnesota have something better to do today. No mention today of 100 violations by agents there of federal court orders. No mention of the sacking of the vain little commander of that operation. No mention of the venomous lies told by Secretary Noem about the shooting victims without investigation or sympathy, as their bereaved families grappled with grief at their deaths. I've done law enforcement briefings, and Rule 1 is to tell the truth. What a strange thing it is to have a hearing about fraud in Minnesota that doesn't acknowledge that the wide-ranging investigation and prosecutions of $9 billion worth of fraud in that state began years ago under the Biden administration. No mention of the fact that the current administration drove out the career prosecutor leading those cases when it demanded he investigate the victim of an ICE shooting, not the agent who did the shooting. 14 prosecutors have left the Minnesota U.S. Attorney's Office in the past month. And what a strange thing it is to have a hearing about fraud that doesn't look at the colossal fraud perpetrated by this administration, starting with the president's own conviction of 34 felony fraud counts, the dismissal of inspectors general who watch out for fraud, the destruction of the Justice Department components that prevent and prosecute corruption, the self-serving billion-dollar crypto deals that line the pockets of the president and his family, the pay-to-play presidential pardons that strip fraud victims of their restitution, the disabling of consumer protection offices and regulators that defend the public against fraud. It is a carnival of fraud and self-dealing. On top of all this, the biggest fraud ever perpetrated in America is going on right now, facilitated and accelerated by the Trump administration and implemented through a massive, semi-covert climate denial fraud operation and a twinned, massive, semi-covert, dark money political corruption operation. This fraud costs Americans hundreds of billions of dollars every year, $770 billion annually, according to the International Monetary Fund, $820 billion annually in healthcare costs, from another report. Climate-related disasters cost the United States $115 billion last year. How was this fraud done? This long-running fraud operation began when oil industry scientists reported to their bosses the dangers of fossil fuel pollution, and instead of responsible stewardship, the bosses hid the reports. That was stage one. Stage two moved from hiding to purposefully misleading. A federal court shut down Big Tobacco's fraud operation to mislead the public about the dangers of tobacco. That tobacco fraud operation was quickly repurposed by Big Oil into its own fraud operation to mislead the public about the dangers of its product. Stage three kicked off with Citizens United, which gave the fossil fuel industry the ability to spend unlimited amounts of political money and spend it secretly. This dark money political corruption operation swiftly strangled bipartisanship on climate. Before stage three, there were multiple bipartisan climate bills in the Senate, and John McCain ran for president on a legitimate climate platform. All of that was killed by fossil fuel dark money. Now we're in the most dangerous stage, where the corruption is so entrenched that the fossil fuel industry can infiltrate and weaponize the federal government as its own industry tool to defeat energy competitors whose product is cleaner, safer, and cheaper. But no Republican dares talk about that problem any longer. Such is the party's dependence on those big fossil fuel donors. President Trump asked the fossil fuel companies for a $1 billion campaign slush fund in 2024, and they expect and got a return on their investment. Quid pro quo. The lies and fraud are legion, but to use just one Rhode Island-based example, senior cabinet officials continually assert that offshore wind is unaffordable when the opposite is true. Anyone reading the contract can see that Revolution Wind will bring 9.9 cent kilowatt hours to an 18 cent kilowatt hour grid. The administration's weaponized attacks, rejected as pretextual, went 0 for 5 in federal court, including before a Trump appointee. Instead of focusing on this massive fraud, or holding the administration accountable for the monumental levels of fraud and corruption in its own ranks, a Texas chairman holds a hearing on fraud in Minnesota, which is neither the biggest issue in Minnesota nor the biggest example of fraud. There's a biblical saying about the mote in another's eye and the beam in your own from the Sermon on the Mount. Why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own? Asked Jesus. I will leave it at that.
I want to commend my Democrat colleagues for giving an ode to Homer Simpson. When something is distracting, scream, squirrel! Because we saw a speech about global warming. We saw a speech about Orange Man bad. We saw a speech about how today's Democrat Party exists seemingly exclusively to defend violent criminal illegal aliens and to demonize law enforcement. And yet, miraculously, in that enormous word cloud virtually nothing about $9 billion stolen from Minnesota taxpayers by Somali fraudsters, with Democrat politicians knowing full well what is happening, facilitating it, and harvesting votes and campaign dollars from the people robbing the children of Minnesota. My Democrat colleagues want you desperately not to focus on those facts. And so instead, miraculously, the Democrats have discovered the Sermon on the Mount. Well, this hearing is going to focus on $9 billion stolen from the taxpayers, and hundreds of millions of those dollars going to the Al-Shabaab terrorist organization funded by the Democrats. As much as my colleagues on that side of the aisle don't want to talk about it. With that, I recognize the chairman of the full committee, Chairman Grassley.
Senator Cruz, thank you for chairing this important subcommittee hearing. And I want to point out an association with your emphasis in your remarks about the importance of whistleblowers and inspectors generals rooting out and exposing fraud. I'll speak about that a little bit, but not as strongly as you have, and I want to say that I appreciate your bringing that up. During my time in the Senate, I've exposed waste, fraud, and abuse within many government programs. At the end of last year, the American people learned of shocking and sophisticated fraud schemes in Minnesota. Billions of taxpayers' dollars may have been lost to crime. What happened in Minnesota is as bad as it gets. These fraud schemes have targeted federal programs designed to help children with autism, the elderly, and small businesses. It's deplorable that fraudsters would target programs designed to help Americans struggling to take care of their children and their families. It's also deplorable that the Walz administration allegedly retaliated against whistleblowers who tried to expose this fraud. If true, such retaliation should not go unpunished. In large-scale fraud schemes like these, whistleblowers are public's greatest asset and allies. Congress, federal agencies, and state agencies must protect whistleblowers, and the executive branch must hold criminals fully accountable to the law. That's why in January I wrote to nearly 10 agencies, including the Department of Justice and the FBI, regarding the allegations. This is all about accountability. I want to know what the government's doing to solve these problems, hold wrongdoers accountable, and take steps to ensure this never happens again. Director Patel announced in December 2025 that the FBI deployed personnel and investigative resources to Minnesota. Attorney General Bondi has ordered additional Department of Justice prosecutors to Minnesota. And on January the 8th, the Trump administration announced the creation of a new division for national fraud enforcement within the Department of Justice. This new division will focus on rooting out fraud across the federal government, and it'll be led by a new Assistant Attorney General. The Treasury Department's introduced additional reporting requirement for banks and other financial institutions in Minnesota. These new requirements are designed to alert regulators to suspicious overseas transfer of cash. Regarding these financial oversight efforts, Secretary Bessent recently stated, quote, Minnesota is going to be the genesis of a national rollout. A national approach is needed now more than ever. The Department of Education has also reportedly begun creating a dedicated fraud detection team and has already prevented $1 billion in student aid fraud since January 2025. I expect the administration to provide the committee with updates regarding these efforts. However, as the title of this hearing suggests, Allegations of fraud have extended beyond Minnesota to other states. Fraudsters are operating on a national scale, affecting federal programs from Medicaid to student aid and beyond. The federal government and state governments, whether Republican or Democrat, are in charge, must always respect the taxpayers and their monies. The same is true of the Inspector General community. Federal and state agencies across the country must work together to get to the bottom of these sophisticated fraud schemes. This should not be a partisan issue. Senator Cruz, thank you again for holding this hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the subcommittee's second hearing this year. Last month, we had to listen to my Republican colleagues push for the impeachment of federal judges who had the nerve to rule against the Trump administration. Today's hearing marks another low. In the last month, federal agents shot and killed 2 of our fellow Americans in Minnesota. Bystanders and journalists have documented numerous abuses of constitutional rights by federal agents in Minneapolis, including warrantless arrest, use of excessive force, racial profiling, surveillance of protesters, and the detention of U.S. citizens and children. This abuse of power and much-needed oversight of the Trump administration should be the focus of this subcommittee because of the individuals involved in what they have done. Somewhere along the way, many of my Republican colleagues decided they could tolerate the scenes of agents shooting innocent American citizens. But the timely topic to them is fraud by one immigrant group in that same state. As part of their ongoing need to carry water for the president, they have chosen to embrace his bigoted attacks on Somali immigrants, whom he has called garbage. The shameful title of today's hearing reflects that same approach. I want to be clear. Fraud is a crime and it should be prosecuted, a court of investigation, and brought to first prosecution. And it is the Trump Justice Department that has diverted prosecutors and FBI agents away from fraud investigations to focus on the president's mass deportation campaign and his effort to establish some sort of retribution for his political enemies. According to the Cato Institute, a conservative operation, American citizens accounted for 95% of federal welfare fraud losses from 2013 to 2024. American citizens. So to suggest that the Somali community is disproportionately responsible for fraud is just not supported by the facts, even from the Cato Institute. If we're serious about fighting fraud, let's talk about a president who has more than doubled his net worth since his return to office. Blind trust as a possibility have been replaced by eyes wide open money grab. Let's talk about senior administration officials who have misused government resources and taxpayers' dollars for personal purposes and travel. Let's talk about fraudsters who have made huge contributions to the president and been rewarded with pardons. Business executives who have committed Medicare fraud, securities fraud, wire fraud, crypto fraud, tax fraud. If we're worried about people breaking the law in Minnesota, our focus should be on the Trump administration's Department of Homeland Security. Last week, the chief federal district judge in Minnesota, a Republican appointee, noted that ICE violated 96 court orders in Minnesota in January alone, likely more than some federal agents have violated in their entire existence. But Minnesota is not the only place suffering from this cruelty of this administration. For months, the administration has targeted my home state of Illinois as part of reckless attacks they claim are law enforcement operations. In reality, they are not enforcing the law. They are breaking it with their racial profiling, detentions, threats, and use of excessive force. Last month, the administration expanded its attacks by trying to freeze billions of dollars in essential funding for children and families in 5 Democratic-led states. Illinois was targeted along with Minnesota, New York, California, and Colorado. Political retribution at the expense of children. The administration provided no support for their allegations that these states were improperly awarding benefits. but the explanation is obvious. This is another act of political retribution by the Trump administration. This hearing is an affront to the people of Minnesota and the memories of those who lost their lives at the hands of immigration officers. The real fraud we should be focused on is the one perpetrated by this president and his acolytes. I yield.
Thank you. I will now introduce the witnesses. The first witness we have is the Honorable Kristen Robbins, a native of Crookston, Minnesota. Kristen Robbins currently serves as the chair of the Fraud Prevention Committee in the Minnesota House of Representatives, where she works to uncover the large-scale fraud in Minnesota and to hold state agencies and fraudsters accountable. Representative Robbins is also co-chair of the bipartisan bicameral Civility Caucus, which aims to build relationships and trust across parties and between the House and Senate. Prior to joining the House in 2018, Representative Robbins co-founded and served as the executive director of the Economic Club of Minnesota, a nonprofit focused on strengthening Minnesota's economic competitiveness, and previously served on the State Commission to End Chronic Homelessness. She received her bachelor's degree in economics and political science from Bethel University and her master's degree in economics from Washington University. Our second witness is Robert Weissman, who is the co-president of Public Citizen, the consumer advocacy and pro-democracy organization. Weissman focuses on government and corporate accountability, among other issues. He is the author of The Corporate Sabotage of America's Future and the co-author of 2 other books. Previously, he worked as director of the corporate accountability organization Essential Action and as editor of the Multinational Monitor, a magazine that tracks multinational corporations. Weissman is a graduate of Harvard College and the Harvard Law School, a fact for which I hope we can forgive him. Our final witness is David Hoke. David Hoke is most well known for his role as the Minneapolis whistleblower in YouTuber Nick Shirley's video uncovering massive fraud within Minnesota's Somali community. Mr. Hoke was born and raised in Minnesota, where he attended the University of Minnesota and ran for Attorney General in 2010. As an investigator, he has devoted considerable time and resources over the last several decades to scrutinizing Minnesota's elected official and exposing corruption. He co-founded Minnesotans for Responsible Government, where he serves as a lobbyist. And we'll start now. Representative Robbins, you're recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for inviting me to testify as chair of the Fraud Prevention and Oversight Committee in the House. I've been working tirelessly over the past year to expose the massive fraud that Tim Walz and his administration has enabled. We've also proposed solutions and worked to hold state agencies and criminals accountable. We have a long way to go, but we are getting results. With my brief remarks, I want to highlight 3 things: how this started, where the money is going, and provide a roadmap for how states can prevent fraud and we can partner better with the federal government. First, how it started. The original fraud scandal was tied to the Child Care Assistance Program, or CCAP, which is a federal program for low-income families with children. There had been allegations of fraud in this program since 2011. By 2014 and 15, there were raids, charges, and convictions of child care providers for billing non-existent or absent children, with fraud exceeding $1 million in some cases. In March and April of 2019, just a few months into the Walz administration, the Legislative Office Auditor published 2 reports about the CCAP fraud. They outlined the fraudulent providers and the alleged movement of millions of dollars in cash out of our state to Somalia, with allegations that the money was going to fund terrorism. Unfortunately, according to multiple whistleblowers, soon after these reports were released, the Criminal Investigation Unit for Child Care Fraud, which had been leading the charge on these prosecutions, was shut down by the Department of Human Services. Rather than conducting criminal investigations of fraud, the Walz administration essentially renamed fraud as overpayment, and they referred any overpayment cases to a new internal overpayment committee, which would decide if they should pursue reimbursement. The DHS staff in this unit were no longer allowed to talk to their counterparts in the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension without prior supervisor approval. Failure to address child care fraud and the decision to stop criminal investigations led directly to the largest COVID fraud scandal in the nation. In March of 2020, Representative Ilhan Omar authored a bill called the Meals Act, which eventually was incorporated into a larger COVID package. This law enabled states to waive the normal eligibility requirements for participating in the National School Lunch Program, eliminating income requirements, site inspections, and expanded distribution methods. Minnesota took full advantage of these waivers and enabled site sponsors like Feeding Our Future, Partners in Quality Care, and Gargar Family Services to bill for hundreds of millions of fake meals for fake children. Just one of these groups, Feeding Our Future, became the largest COVID fraud in state and national history, bilking taxpayers of at least $250 million. To date, there have been 78 indictments and 61 convictions in the Feeding Our Future scandal, with more cases to go on trial this spring. The Feeding Our Future prosecutions then revealed that as many as half of those defendants were also getting state money in other Medicaid-funded programs. Yet despite reports on this back in 2023, more than 3 years ago, Tim Walz and his agencies didn't stop those defendants from getting additional state money in other Medicaid programs. We now have found fraud in multiple Medicaid programs, including autism centers, sober homes, non-emergency medical transportation, integrated community supports, and housing stabilization services. In December, our committee held a hearing on credible allegations of fraud in 2 new areas: adult day services and assisted living facilities. We now have seen allegations of fraud in 14 Medicaid programs. The former first U.S. attorney who led these prosecutions for years stated that the estimated fraud is $9 billion. And this doesn't count fraud in SNAP or child care programs. So where's the money going? Minnesotans pay their taxes and they expect their money to go to things that help their communities: roads, schools, healthcare, and not to be taken by criminals, to buy resorts in Kenya, apartments in Nairobi, property in Turkey, or luxury homes and cars in the U.S. Worse yet, Minnesota taxpayers have allegedly found their ways into the hands of terrorist organizations like Al-Shabaab, both directly and indirectly. The money is walking out the door at the Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport. Back in 2017, the estimate was about $100 million in cash was going out annually from our airport. According to TSA, in 2024, there were $340 million in cash outbound, and in 2025, it was $350 million. This is astonishing, not only because of the amount, but because it is so out of proportion to other airports. The cash out of Minneapolis is 99% higher than cash going out of Dallas, Atlanta, and JFK in New York. It's 90% higher than what's going out of Seattle. Minnesotans are incredibly frustrated that their hard-earned money is being siphoned off by criminals while their taxes keep going up and vulnerable citizens don't get the services they need. Other states should learn from our failures. There are some basic common sense principles to stop the fraud. First, culture matters. Fraud flourishes when leaders ignore it and criminals see they can get away with it. Tim Walz has not held anyone responsible. Second, fraud flourishes when basic internal controls are not followed. This is not complicated. Third, truth matters. We cannot be cowed by charges of racism or Islamophobia, which have been successfully weaponized to limit scrutiny and fraud in Minnesota for years. This is not ancient history. It is still happening. When I testified before the House Oversight Committee on January 7th, I was stunned to be called a racist 6 times in that hearing. This is the same playbook that has been used to protect Minnesota criminals for years. Anytime a whistleblower or legislator raised questions about Somali fraud in daycares, nutrition centers, autism centers, they were called a racist or said that charges of racism would ruin their careers. So where do we go from here? State and federal partners work together. We need your help to have more audits of these programs and to enforce current laws that require states to pay back in 1 year if they have been found fraud or overpayment. We also need the federal government to require documentation, not just attestation, for eligibility in these programs. We also need more resources at the U.S. Attorney's Office and CMS to help with investigations. And finally, the federal government should have greater power of oversight and investigation of cash going out of our country. I'm thankful for the brave whistleblowers, journalists, and the federal and state partners in this committee for helping us identify fraud. We cannot allow this to continue. The time for accountability and justice is now.
Ms. Wiseman.
Thank you, Senator Graham and members of the committee. Fraud and scams are indeed a scourge in America, across this country, not limited to Minnesota. Taxpayers are cheated when fraud is done against government programs. Beneficiaries are harmed as well. Fraud in the private sector steals billions from consumers and in extreme cases drains families of life savings and sends them into a cycle of misery. Unfortunately, the reality is the Trump administration is systematically dismantling the anti-fraud programs of the federal government. Those programs aim to deter fraud, punish wrongdoers, and bring restitution to victims. The administration is undermining all of that. It is fair to say, in fact, that through its actions, the administration is fostering more fraud, facilitating more scams, empowering corporate and small-time fraudsters alike, and depriving victims of the justice to which they are entitled. As regards Minnesota, there plainly is some fraud that has gone on, as there is throughout this country. Where there is fraud, it should be investigated and prosecuted. No one wants tougher enforcement more than legitimate providers and the beneficiaries of the programs that are being defrauded. That said, it is unhelpful to make claims about fraud in Minnesota or anywhere else based on exaggerated numbers or shaky evidence. And in the case of Minnesota, it's worth pointing out that the efforts by the U.S. Attorney are being undermined by this administration driving out the people who are engaged in the prosecution of the fraud in Minnesota and by diverting the FBI from its work on fraud to immigration enforcement. Moreover, there is no justification for suspending social service programs, vital social service programs, as we all agree, as punishment for fraud. That punishes innocent people and leaves the fraudsters alone. Nor, obviously, is there any rationale for pursuing suspension of programs on a partisan basis. Now, the subtitle of this hearing is dealing with fraud in Minnesota and beyond. I wanted to pull back and talk for a few moments about the beyond. To be clear, the actions of this administration are undermining governmental, anti-fraud, and accountability agencies. When it comes to corporate fraud or scams perpetrated by those close to the administration, the policy is to ignore, forgive, or coddle the wrongdoers if they're actually caught. Moreover, the president and his top aides are shattering norms of conflict of interest and basic ethical standards, creating a culture of impunity that for sure is encouraging more fraud against the government and around the country. This is not an administration that is determined to root out fraud. In short, for the super rich and for the super connected, this is an administration that is taking the anti-fraud cops off the beat. And for those who manage to get caught anyway, they give them and are doling out get-out-of-jail-free cards. Let me explain the evidence behind this. When it comes to the Department of Justice, this administration has gutted or disbanded the public integrity section, the consumer protection branch of the agency. It has fired the agency's top ethics advisor. It has issued guidance to soften corporate crime enforcement. The president has pursued his pardon power in strange service of fraudsters. Leaving aside the January 6th pardon, more than 1/3 of all of the president's pardons have gone to those who perpetrated fraud or similar kinds of crimes. Those pardons have led to the cancellation of $1.5 billion in fines and restitution owed, including more than $1 billion owed to victims of fraud and wrongdoing. So the pardons themselves have re-victimized the victims. The president has eviscerated the system of inspectors general that the chairman was referencing earlier and for whom has done so much to advance that IG system. Not only did he fire 17 IGs at the start of his administration, he is responsible for firing 2/3 of presidentially appointed inspectors general. 3/4 of the inspectors general top offices were empty as of October. We've looked at the staffing inside the IG's offices, drastic cuts across the board. The president had shuttered the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, illegally in our estimation, closing down the most important anti-fraud agency in the federal government. He has slashed staffing at the Internal Revenue Service by more than a quarter, guaranteeing an increase in tax fraud, avoidance, and cheating, primarily by the super rich, and costing taxpayers approximately $200 billion over the next 10 years, according to Yale University analysts. He has canceled enforcement against large corporations more than 150 separate times that we've been able to document in the first year of the administration. He has engaged in rampant conflicts of interest, including most startlingly a joint venture with a UAE-affiliated company, as reported by the Wall Street Journal this past weekend, compromising our foreign policy, destroying basic ethics standards, and inviting more fraud and wrongdoing by others around the country. He has destroyed the East Wing of the White House and then solicited funds from corporations and the super rich to pay for his ballroom. Our investigations found that 2/3 of those corporations contributing had government contracts, more than $200 billion in contracts over the previous 3 years. This committee is absolutely right to focus on fraud. Senator Cruz is absolutely right to bring his righteous anger against fraud. But that fraud is not limited to Minnesota. That's small potatoes compared to what this administration is perpetrating. I encourage this committee to focus on that fraud, to pursue the reversal of the policies that I've identified, and serve the American people who absolutely, on a unified basis, want to counter fraud and wrongdoing in the government and in the private sector.
Ms. Troke.
My name is David Hoke. I was born in Minneapolis. I'm a lifelong resident of the Twin Cities area. And although it's not in my testimony, I take exception to Mr. Weissman's questioning of my data as being inaccurate. I'll get back to that. My journey into uncovering fraud in Minnesota, and ultimately throughout the entire United States, as it turns out, began when I started to notice very unusual changes in the Minneapolis area. Remember, I grew up there, so I know Minneapolis very well. Most notably, the enormous number of child care facilities that had opened up. I would drive around the Twin Cities, and it seemed these child care facilities were literally on every block. Some blocks had 2 or 3 child care facilities on the same block. Minnesota sees a fair amount of snow in the winter, and I began to notice, driving by these child care facilities, there were never any footprints in the snow outside these child care facilities. And I'd go by them 3, 4, 5 times a day, Monday through Friday, because my office is in the heart of where a lot of these child care facilities are. So I said, well, what's going on here with all these child care facilities? So I began to check the Minnesota Secretary of State's website to find out just who owned all these child care facilities. And guess what? Every single one of them was Somali owned. Not every child care facility in Minnesota was, but the ones that I was looking at that were by my office, and there were a lot of them. What's even stranger is that every one of these facilities is located in a commercial or industrial building, no play areas, bad neighborhoods, and several of the child care facilities had signage which stated they were open either 7 a.m. to 10 p.m., 2 p.m. to 10 p.m., Quality Learning Center, for example, or open 24 hours. Who the heck brings their kid to stay overnight at a child care facility in a rough neighborhood? None of it made any sense. The Leering misspelling was the final straw for me. That's the spark that ignited my full-on investigation. So Minnesota has 2 different child care licenses available. One covers 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., and the other one covers 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. They're 2 very different licenses. So for a child care facility to be open 24 hours a day, or even from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m., they need both licenses. How many of these facilities that are open these extended hours have 2 licenses? None of them. 0. They all have only 1 license. Minnesota child care supervision requirements include the following. For infant care, that's 0 to 17 months of age, you have to have 1 adult supervising for every 4 children, and max 8 in a group. For toddlers, which is 18 and 23 months of age, it requires 1 adult for every 5 children to supervise, max 10 children in that group. For 2-year-olds, you need 1 adult for every 7 children, so max 14 in a group. So if a child care facility was billing the state of Minnesota for 99 children, i.e. Quality Living Center, that child care facility would need to have at least 8 employees supervising those children. These cannot be 1099 employees. They have to be W-2 employees. That means we're going to have at least 8 W-2s, and we're going to have at least 8 I-9s. So if the feds went in and checked that, what do you think they're going to find? You already know the answer. One issue that is often brought up is that we are unfairly targeting the Somali community. This is a fair point to be made. As one Somali gentleman exclaimed in our second video, we're not the only community that does fraud. Fraud certainly exists in every community. It was the sheer volume and the blatant nature of the Somali fraud that demanded my attention. When one facility, Mako Childcare, has another childcare, mini childcare, registered at the same address, but the sign still says Mako Childcare, it kind of stands out. And again, no children, no footprints in the snow, ever. This is what I mean by being blatant. Misspelled signage, posted hours that require 2 licenses, no child footprints in the snow, not even once. So how did we arrive at this point? Why are we having this hearing? We got here because of politicians, almost exclusively Democrats. A couple of names come to mind. Jody Harpstead, the former commissioner of the Department of Human Services, and Shireen Gandhi, the current commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Human Services. Harpstead put the whole fraud on steroids. She was steering the ship from 2019 to 2025 during the COVID-19 pandemic. This is when the whole fraud network exploded into what we see nationally today and to what we see in my numbers, which are accurate. So now we hear that the Minnesota Department of Human Services is forging documents and backdating paperwork, all in an effort to cover up their complicity in this fraud. This is just more criminal behavior from the gang at the Minnesota Department of Human Services. It's criminal behavior. Minneapolis was the incubator for this nationwide fraud, which we're now seeing in Maine, we're seeing it in Washington State, we're seeing it in Columbus, Ohio. It was constructed here in Minneapolis. And the idea behind it was if you can get a population in here and fit them into this fraud framework, you have a guaranteed voting block for all eternity. The fraud was started and then it expanded out, and now you see it all around the country. So why is fraud bad? Why is it a bad thing? Why does anybody care? Fraud is bad because it steals from the blind, it steals from kids with cancer, it steals from disabled, it steals from the homeless, it steals from wounded veterans, it steals from everybody in this room. So what is the answer? How do we fix this? The way we fix this is that the federal government has to go to the Minnesota Department of Human Services and every social service agency and say, look, if you issue a payment using federal money and it goes to a fraudulent company, you run the risk of us coming in, arresting you, handcuffing you, parading you out, bringing you in front of a judge, and putting you in prison. So if you're going to issue a payment, you better make sure that it's a legitimate company. Otherwise, don't issue the payment. Go on Google Earth. Look at, it's a liquor store. It's a grocery store. Why are you issuing payment to a child care or a transportation company that doesn't even exist? Why are you issuing that payment? It's criminal behavior. The federal government has to use that cudgel over these people and say, look, you better be sure if you issue that payment that it's a legitimate payment or you could end up in prison. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we move to questioning, I want to ask if each of the witnesses could rise so that I can administer the oath. If you would raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony that you are about to give before this subcommittee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
All of you have answered affirmatively. You can have a seat, and I hope your opening statements were truthful. I should have done that before your opening statements, but I guess we'll have to take your word for it. Representative Robbins, let's start with you. How broad was the fraud that was perpetrated in Minnesota?
We are still getting a handle on it, but it's all of the, not all of, but a huge segment of the child care programs, autism services, sober homes, emergency transportation, of 14 areas of Medicaid fraud, SNAP benefits. We are still I would say getting whistleblower reports, uncovering new vectors of fraud. We just discovered the adult day services and the assisted living. Those haven't been counted in the total so far. So I believe it's much broader than we currently know, and we will continue to expose it.
Is there any chance the elected Democrats in charge of the state were unaware of the fraud?
No. There have been credible whistleblower allegations, press reports, and Office of Legislative Auditor reports for many years.
Mr. Hoke, I want to thank you for your citizen journalism and your hard work pressing for accountability here. I will say I watched the video that you did with rapt attention. It was profoundly effective. It was also, by the way, an indictment of all of the so-called journalists on the national level, because none of them could be bothered to actually go and investigate. I want to ask you the same questions I asked Representative Robbins. Number one, how broad do you believe the evidence shows the fraud in Minnesota was?
It's easily in excess of $30 billion when you take everything into account. You've got all of these NGOs, you've got nonprofits, you've got county money, you've got city money, you've got CCAP money, you've got another thing called Great Start. So there are all these piles of money that factor into the fraud. I don't know that anybody can ever determine an exact number, but I kept telling the U.S. attorney when he came out, he said, you got to get your number up, you got to get your number up, and he did. He kept ratcheting up the number, and I kept saying, you got to be at least at $30 billion. So going back to whether Governor Walz knew about it, Governor Walz admitted knowing about the fraud early in his first term, which would say 2020. Well, Minnesota Statute 3.971, Subdivision 9, clearly says that if you are made aware of fraud in a state agency, you are obligated to immediately report that fraud to the Office of the Legislative Auditor. Immediately. The Legislative Auditor is then the body that determines which law enforcement agency to bring into the investigation. Governor Walz did not contact the Office of the Legislative Auditor. He said he contacted the FBI. About what? That's not what the law says.
How many organizations receiving taxpayer funds did you visit in total?
How many?
How many organizations or ostensible organizations?
Companies? Yeah. 200.
Of the child care centers you visited, how many kids did you see?
The only place that I saw children was at KinderCare and New Horizons, which are, in my opinion, legitimate. They're large scale. They have play areas. And they also receive CCAP money, but they're the only places that I saw where there were children present, ever, at any of them.
How about the autism centers? Did you see children? Did you see patients there?
Never. So that's not to say there weren't any, but there were never there. There were never any there. When I was there, never any footprints in the snow, same thing.
Mr. Weissman, you're co-president of Public Citizen, which describes itself as a consumer advocate and a pro-democracy organization. Would you agree that the fraud in Minnesota was staggering and shocking?
I agree that there is fraud in Minnesota. I don't believe these estimates are grounded in any evidence that I've seen. The $9 billion figure was based on a claim just that, well, I think that half of them must be fraudulent. I just heard a comment just saying, boost the number up. But to be clear, and with respect, you missed my testimony. No question there's fraud in Minnesota, and absolutely I share your righteous anger about whatever degree of fraud there was there.
Do you agree that any Democrat politician, or let me be clear, any Republican politician that had knowledge of the fraud and was complicit should be prosecuted?
I'm not sure what they're being prosecuted for, but also in my testimony, I described also outside of Minnesota the manifold ways that this administration is enabling fraud.
Look, I understand. And the reason, hold on.
The standard is that you want
to prosecute. Sir, I'm going to ask a question, and then you can answer it.
Yes, sir.
Your organization describes itself as a pro-democracy organization. I'm going to try to find out if you actually are pro-democracy or if you're simply pro-Democrat and are a partisan. We've seen the Democrats who want to change the topic. So I get you want to testify how much you hate Donald Trump. but I'm quite certain Donald Trump was not running a fraudulent daycare center or a fraudulent autism center in Minnesota. So all of the talking points about how you dislike Trump, set them aside. We will see the Democrats on this committee go down those talking points. Do you believe elected politicians in Minnesota who were aware of this fraud and were complicit in it should be prosecuted? Should there be accountability?
There absolutely should be accountability. It is not normal to prosecute government officials for not prosecuting fraud. That is not a standard I'm aware of that you've advocated or that anyone else has advocated in the Senate.
So do you think it's perfectly okay?
I did not say
if
it's okay.
let's say Governor Walz or Attorney General Ellison knew about the fraud, benefited from the fraud in terms of bundling votes, benefited from the frauds in terms of collecting campaign finance violations, and deliberately looked the other way. You think that's not criminal conduct?
In that hypothetical, it is not okay. 100% not okay. But also, if you'll permit me, that hypothetical is in fact happening throughout.
Okay, yes, I get it. You dislike Trump. I understand you dislike Trump,
sir. It is whether I have a standard of accountability.
So let me, sir, please do not interrupt me. Please do not.
I'm being clear.
Please do not interrupt me. Please do not interrupt me.
Sir.
You may answer questions after I ask them. You've heard the evidence and testimony about daycare centers with no children, with no toys, with no facilities, with windows that are blacked out. Do you believe it is possible that the officials sending millions of dollars to those fake daycare centers and fake autism centers didn't know what was going on?
Well, what I heard was claims about that, and I too have watched the video. We're both parents. I'm glad that the child care centers don't open their door for someone who's knocking there. I don't view that as evidence that the child care centers are fake child care centers, although I'm sure there are some. My understanding is that state investigators have gone to do their duty at those exact same child centers and have found that most of them actually are operating correctly.
Well, I will say it is disappointing that you had a chance leading a nonprofit that is supposedly pro-democracy to take a principled stand. Instead, you decided to defend the Somali fraudsters because it benefits elected Democrats. That's disappointing. But you know what? I'm going to give you something you're going to like, an opportunity to say all the ways you dislike President Trump, because I'm going to recognize the ranking member who will surely ask you why Trump is terrible and do everything you and he can do to change the topic from the actual topic of this hearing. Ranking Member Whitehouse.
Before we get to that, I don't want to leave what seemed to be a pretty flagrant mischaracterization of your testimony without an opportunity for you to address that mischaracterization, if you would care to begin with that.
I appreciate that. Just briefly, I was disagreeing with the premise of the question that we have been displayed this evidence showing criminal wrongdoing. Obviously, where there is criminal wrongdoing, and I testified to this, I support aggressive investigation and prosecution. To the degree there is wrongdoing in Minnesota, it should be aggressively investigated and prosecuted. I'm not sure that the claim that all the evidence we've been presented today is in fact evidence of that, but I don't deny it for a moment that it is occurring in Minnesota.
Let me ask you another question. In a democracy, is there a significant difference between private individuals engaging in fraud and self-dealing against the government and government officials, public officials, engaging in fraud and self-dealing against the government?
They are both wrong, concerning, problematic, but the betrayal by public officials is morally and from a political point of view more consequential.
Yeah, it's a worse element, isn't it? So the chairman has pointed out that President Trump did not run a fake daycare. What are the 4 or 5 things that Trump did that used his position to enrich himself and his family at the expense of the American taxpayer?
Well, I've detailed this in my testimony. Most shockingly is the report from the Wall Street Journal this past weekend about a Trump-connected business partnering with UAE in a deal that directly put $187 million in the pockets of the president and his family. He additionally has joint ventures or elaborate licensing deals with Saudi companies, companies from Qatar. He's engaged in this elaborate cryptocurrency arrangements that have made him at least $2 billion by independent estimates, and maybe even more, just in the course of the last year.
And let's look for a moment at the pardon process, which used to be operated under the supervision and scrutiny of the Department of Justice and now appears to have moved to the lounge at Mar-a-Lago. It seems that there is a pay-to-play arrangement by which people can acquire pardons. Can you elaborate on that?
You know, well, we've seen the president use his pardon power aggressively, and I don't begrudge him for doing that whatsoever. But what is shocking is that, leaving aside the January 6 pardons, they've been so heavily focused on those who've committed white-collar crimes, and particularly fraud.
Fraud crimes.
People who have committed those crimes, shown no remorse for those crimes, owed restitution for those crimes, or excused for restitution for those crimes, and who appear to be getting off because of their connection to the president, because they've hired high-priced lobbyists to get them there, or have made, or they or their families have made contributions to the president's political committees or those that benefit him directly.
Do you think that fits into what the public generally understands to be pay to play?